Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video about Windows Server Update Services. In this video, we'll take a look at what WSUS is exactly and how we use it. We'll look at the different WSUS scenarios that we have available to us, whether it be just a single WSUS server or a set of independent WSUS servers, a hierarchy of WSUS servers, which could then be placed into autonomous or replica mode, or possibly a set of disconnected WSUS servers. We'll take a look at all those different options. Then we'll go in and see what GlobalMantics wants to do with their WSUS servers. And then we're going to get into the operating system. We're going to download and install WSUS. I'll show you how to configure computer groups with both server-side or client-side targeting. And then I'll show you how to configure your clients to use the WSUS server for updates using group policy. First of all, what exactly is WSUS? Well, on the screen here I have a representation of what we used to have before WSUS. We would have large quantities of client computers who would each independently have to do a Windows update and communicate with Microsoft's update server independently. So for example, I have one client here who would have to go across our network, through the router, out to the internet, and over to Microsoft's update server just to do a query to see if there were any updates available. If there are updates available, well then the update server needs to go ahead and not only communicate that, but download those updates back to the individual machine. And I'll tell you what, just doing that once can use up quite a bit of bandwidth. Imagine having to do that with each and every client out there. Well, that would be kind of crazy. WSUS gives us the ability to now have all of our clients communicate with a WSUS server for their updates. See, what happens is the WSUS server will go ahead and go out onto the internet, communicate with Microsoft's update server, and then Microsoft's update server will send those updates just to the WSUS server. Everybody else on the network will now communicate directly with the WSUS server and no longer have to tie up that internet bandwidth. Now, as far as why to use WSUS, well, one of the reasons I was just explaining. It helps save internet bandwidth, and it also makes more efficient use of Microsoft's update servers. Imagine how bogged down their servers get when you have not just hundreds of thousands of different organizations trying to communicate with them for updates, but now take each one of those organizations and multiply by the number of clients they have. It's just outrageous. So it's really a win-win. It saves your internet bandwidth and also saves Microsoft's server capacity. Now, the second benefit to why we use WSUS is WSUS gives administrators control over what updates are sent to the clients. And they do this by allowing administrators to test and approve the updates before the clients are allowed to have them. And we'll take a look at this when we look at the interface. We'll see how updates are brought to the WSUS server, but they just sit there. They just sit there idle, waiting to be sent out until an administrator goes in and says, okay, yes, I have tested and approved this update. Clients can now have them. Now, one more thing you should know about WSUS is that it's not included with Windows Server 2008. As a matter of fact, it's not included with any Windows operating system. It is, however, a free download from Microsoft. So it's not going to cost you anything, but it is going to take the effort of going out there and downloading it. Now, the latest version right now, as I'm recording this, is WSUS 3.0 with Service Pack 1. This was also the first version to be used with Windows Server 2008. Now, this version, or whatever the latest version is, can be downloaded from the following links. The first one is my favorite, nice, easy to remember, www.microsoft.com/WSUS. Okay, very easy to remember. But the reason I have a second one listed here, because it's like, well, who would use the first one when you can do the second one, is because technically, when you enter this first one, it's just going to redirect you to here anyway. This was the original link that they had until they gave the simple redirect from Microsoft.com/WSUS. Now, let's take a look at some of the different scenarios that we have out there when it comes to WSUS. The first one I have on the screen right now is, well, this is the exact same diagram I just had up a few moments ago. This is for the single server. In other words, you just have one WSUS server who is serving your entire company. Okay? And there's nothing really special to tell you about this. It's just one WSUS server is going to go ahead and communicate with Microsoft Update Server, and every client in the organization is going to communicate with the WSUS server. Now, although this may be the easiest to implement, it's not necessarily the most practical, because when you get up to tens, hundreds, thousands of clients, well, one WSUS server may not be able to handle it. So we need to talk about some scenarios that involve multiple WSUS servers. And the first one I want to talk about here is the independent. The independent scenario is just what it sounds like. We have one WSUS server here who is serving this network, and one WSUS server here which is serving this network. And they are completely independent of one another. In other words, each one of these two servers are going to go ahead and communicate directly with Microsoft's Update Server. Okay, and they're going to be completely independent of one another. There's going to be no replication or synchronization of any kind. You know what this also means is that you're going to have an administrator over here managing this WSUS server, an administrator over here managing this WSUS server, and realizing, even if it's the same person, even if it's the same administrator, that each one has to be done independently and in its entirety. In other words, everything you do on one, you're going to have to do on the other. Now, this is not a very common scenario. This maybe used to be before we really had a lot of the features that we have today, but basically we now have the ability to do replication and synchronization to where we don't necessarily want this complete independence. Now, the first form of this synchronization, if you want to call it that, would be in the form called autonomous mode. Now, in autonomous mode, here's how things work. You have one WSUS server who's going to go ahead and go out onto the internet and communicate with Microsoft's Update Server. And Microsoft's Update Server will go ahead and send all updates to that WSUS server. Now, that WSUS server is going to go ahead, in this case, and service all these clients. Okay, all these clients are going to go ahead and communicate with this WSUS server. But all of these clients over here, well, they're going to go ahead and look to another WSUS server. This WSUS server will be configured as a downstream server from the first one. So what will happen is this WSUS server will go ahead and do its communication with the first WSUS server, not going out to the internet to Microsoft's Update Server. Okay, only one server is going out and getting the original updates, and then that one WSUS server is not only serving clients, but it's also serving another WSUS server. Now, here's what makes it autonomous. Even though the updates themselves are being synchronized over to the second WSUS server, the approvals of those updates, the decision on what updates go out to the clients, does not synchronize over. And what that means is you would have to have another administrator over here who's going to look at the updates and decide what's going to go out to these clients on this part of the network. Now, another version that is very similar to this would be in replica mode. In replica mode, everything works exactly as it works in autonomous mode. In other words, you have the one WSUS server who's going to go ahead and communicate with Microsoft's Update Server, and the other WSUS server is going to be a downstream server communicating with the first WSUS server, and each server will go ahead and service its own set of clients. The difference here is that this synchronization that goes from WSUS server number 1 to WSUS server number 2 is complete. It's complete with not only the updates, but the approvals and everything else. So the difference here is that you would only have the one administrator having to go through and approve updates, but yet you could have other WSUS servers, which are really nothing more than just replicas, to help service all the different clients out on the network. This, matter of fact, I will say these last two, autonomous mode and replica mode scenarios, are probably the two most common scenarios out there because most of our networks are going to be too large for a single WSUS server, while at the same time we don't want complete independence. Usually we want to go ahead and have one WSUS server communicating with the outside world with Microsoft's update server, and then we'll simply replicate that information out to the other WSUS servers to service all the various clients around the network. It's just a matter of deciding, do we want to have a separation when it comes to the approval administration, or do we want to have it all done in one place? Now, before we get into what GlobalMantics wants to do, there is one more scenario, and that would be where you have a completely disconnected network like we have here. If you look carefully, you'll notice there is no connectivity with this network from anything else. It just kind of stands alone. And so what we have in this instance is a network over here which is connected to the internet, where you have a WSUS server which will go ahead and do the connectivity with Microsoft's update server, and of course go ahead and service all these clients. But then what you have to do is go ahead and basically export out the updates and or approval information. And very often you would export it out, let's say, onto a CD. Here's my beautiful picture of a CD, right? And then you would ship that CD off to the other office where you could go ahead and insert the CD and get your updates that way. That is something that is now available with WSUS. Is whether you are completely disconnected or maybe just for security's sake, you want to go ahead and not be connected, you can go ahead and do this offline update, if you want to call it that. So those are all the different WSUS scenarios that are available. Now, what's GlobalMantics doing? Well, GlobalMantics needs to streamline the process of getting updates to its clients worldwide. Okay, obviously, that's the whole point behind WSUS in the first place. Only one server in the GlobalMantics organization should communicate with Microsoft's update server. Even though GlobalMantics is a worldwide organization, in the entire world, we want just one server to get its updates directly from Microsoft. We don't want to tie up any more bandwidth out on the internet than that. Now, administrators in New York, Chicago, and Tokyo will be responsible for testing and approving updates for their own respective offices. So in order for that to happen, if you're not already thinking it, it sounds to me like what we're going to probably need to do, since we only want one server to go out to Windows Update, and we want 3 different offices here to each have WSUS servers and have approval of these updates out to their clients, it sounds like we need to do autonomous mode so that we have each office having its own administrator approving those updates. But the Chicago administrators will also be responsible for approving updates for the Dallas office. So what that means is that the WSUS server in the Dallas office will probably be set up in replica mode, and we'll go ahead and just get a replica of the WSUS server in the Chicago office. Are you confused yet? All right, well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we go in and actually take a look at our servers and get this all set up? So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and, first of all, we need to download WSUS 3.0 Service Pack 1. After we have it downloaded, we're going to go ahead and install it. We'll need to then configure it, and when we're configuring it, I'm going to show you how the configuration is going to be slightly different in each of the different offices to go ahead and meet the requirements that GlobalMantics has set up. Now, one other thing that I'm going to show you is I'm going to also show you how to configure computer groups, and this will help with the figuring out of who is servicing what computers, and more specifically, what updates are going out to which computers or being approved for which computers. And then I'll also show you how to go in and configure the clients to use the WSUS servers for their updates. Because obviously it doesn't do a whole lot of good to set up all these WSUS servers and then have all our clients go out to the internet and communicate directly with Windows Update, right? Okay, so let's go in and let's get this all done now. Now, for this demonstration, we're going to need to use a few different computers. right? Because we need to have a WSUS server in every office in the Global Mantics organization. Now in the New York office, we're going to use New York member 1. You want to avoid using a domain controller as your WSUS server whenever possible. If for no other reason, you want to do it for security reasons. This is a server that you are going to regularly be sending out on the internet, so you might want to avoid a domain controller if for no other reason than that. Now, in Chicago, even though we have a member server, we're not going to use it. We're going to go ahead and use Chicago DC1. Now, there's 2 reasons why. One reason is because even though we have a member server, it's Windows Server 2003. And now originally, WSUS 3.0 SP1 didn't even look like it was going to support Windows Server 2003, whereas now it does with Service Pack. But we want to look at everything from a Windows Server 2008 point of view, so we're going to use the domain controller, which is Windows Server 2008. In Dallas, we only have the one server, so we'll use Dallas DC1. And in Tokyo, again, we only have the one server, so we'll use Tokyo DC1. First, we need to go ahead and connect to New York member 1. So let's go ahead and connect to that now. Alright, now that we're connected to New York member 1, the first thing I want to go over with you are the installation requirements for WSUS. And the way I'd like to show these to you is by going to Internet Explorer. And then I have a favorite that's been saved here, let me show you, for the WSUS installation requirements. You may want to take a moment to pause the video and jot down the URL, which is listed right up here, http://en-us/library/cc708484.aspx. The reason you may want to look at this URL is not only does it give us the installation requirements, but if you look over on the left-hand side here, there's actually 7 different steps that this article reviews, ranging from the installation requirements all the way through approving and deploying your updates. So if you ever need a good reference guide to go back to, this is one I would recommend. Anyway, if we come over here to review the installation requirements, you just scroll down a little bit here. We want to go down, this is for Server 2003, we want to go down to the part where it says right here, server requirements for installing on Windows Server 2008. And you'll see here that it says IIS 7 must be installed. So we need the IIS role to be installed. And then more specifically, it talks about how the following components must be enabled. So in just a minute here, we're going to go ahead and install the IIS role, and we'll make sure to hit each one of these components. Also, you'll see here that it says you need the Microsoft Report Viewer Redistributable 2005. And to download it, there's a link here. Now, this particular feature is not a requirement. I know it's listed as a requirement, but it's only a requirement if you're going to be doing reporting. And when we install WSUS, I'll show you exactly where it points that out. And then here is where it says you need SQL Server Service Pack 1, but again, only if you're using a SQL database. So anyway, the point here is that you may need all of this, but the only actual requirement is that we install the IIS role with the following features. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to go ahead and click on Start, go to our Server Manager, click on Roles, and then we will add a role. Once we're in the Add Roles wizard, we'll go ahead and click on Web Server or IIS. And you'll see here that right away it says that other required features must also be installed. So let's add those required features and click Next. Here's an intro to what web services are. We'll click Next. Now you'll notice that there are a whole lot of services to choose from here. So if we were to go back to our list down here on Internet Explorer, you'll see here that it wants you to select Windows Authentication. So let's go down here to Windows Authentication and check the box. And it says we must have ASP.NET. So we'll scroll up here and select ASP.NET. Now watch what happens when I click this one. Again, additional services and features are required, so let's go ahead and add those. You'll see a lot of checkboxes have now been selected. If we come back here, it says we need the 6.0 management compatibility. So we scroll down here, and here's our IIS 6 management compatibility. And you'll notice it includes all the different IIS compatibilities, including the Metabase compatibility, which was the last item on our list. So what that means is, let me go ahead and close this window. We are all set to install this role. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Here's a review of everything that's going to be installed, and I'll click Install. Now I will tell you, while this is installing, the reason why it requires the IIS role and all the associated services is because WSUS is all web-based. It's all managed through the internet browser. So in order to be managed through an internet browser, you must have the web services available to set this up pretty much like a web server. Okay, this is just about done installing. And there we go. It has now completed. Installation has succeeded. I'm going to click Close. And we now have the web services that are required. So I'm going to go ahead and close this window. We now need to download WSUS to be installed. It's a real easy link to remember where to download WSUS. Let me click on Internet Explorer. I'm going to put in www.microsoft.com/WSUS. Easy enough to remember. This will now take you to the location where you can, over here on the left-hand side, download WSUS 3.0. So I'm going to click that link. Then you click on the link here where it says Download Files Below. And then you'll see we have, well, here's the end user license agreement, but right here we have the two different setups. The one for the 64-bit operating system and the x86, which is for 32-bit operating systems. So you need to determine which one you are running. Now the one I'm on is a 32-bit version of Windows Server 2008. The way you can recognize this on your own system is by clicking Start and then right-clicking on the word Computer and selecting Properties. And then right here you'll see System Type 32-bit operating system, or in your case you may see 64-bit operating system. Depending on which one you're running, you want to download the appropriate one. So in my case, I'm going to download the x86 version. And I'm going to go ahead and save it. And I'm going to click Browse Folders and put it right on my desktop, just so it'll be nice and easy to locate. Now, depending on your bandwidth and the speed of Microsoft's servers at this very moment, it will vary how fast this will download. As you can see, I have almost a minute left. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pause the video. If you're downloading, please do the same, and then go ahead and resume when the download is complete. Okay, the download is now complete, so I'll go ahead and close this window and close the Internet Explorer window. And you'll see here on my desktop I now have the WSUS setup executable. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on that executable and tell it I want to go ahead and run it. It extracts the files and takes us into the wizard. I'll click Next. And you have a choice between a full server installation or simply the administration console. If you wanted to be able to manage your WSUS server from a remote computer, one of the ways you could do it is by installing the administration console only. But in this case, we want the full installation. I'll click Next. And what it was doing there while it said it was preparing was it was verifying that you have met the minimum requirements. If you're following along and you got an error at this point, read the error, see what you're missing, and then go ahead and add those missing components. Now I need to go ahead and agree to the license agreement. Click Next. Now here is where you get that screen I was telling you about where it says there is a required component, and it's the Microsoft Report Viewer Redistributable. Well, this is only required if you're going to do reporting, which we're not going to get into right now, and that's why I didn't worry about it. If you want to play around with reporting, go ahead and download this from the link that was in that TechNet article, and then you should be able to go ahead and do reporting just fine. Also, you'll see here that it gives you the ability to move forward, and it says if you want to do this, install these components after installing Windows Server Update Services. So I'll go ahead and click on Next. Now I need to select an update source. I need to determine where it is that I want to store the updates. And you'll see here it says if you have a drive formatted with NTFS and at least 6 gig of free disk space, you can use it to store updates. Now, if you decide that you do not have a location, which in this case our C drive has plenty of available space, I'm just going to put it in a folder called WSUS. The default is just fine. Typically, you may want to actually have a separate volume or separate partition or possibly even a separate drive to store these updates, but that's a decision that you would need to make based upon your scenario. If you were to uncheck this box saying I don't want to store updates locally because I don't have enough space or I don't want to tie up the space, then what's going to happen is the updates are going to still be stored out on Microsoft's update servers, which is perfectly acceptable. But in this case, you're not saving a whole lot of bandwidth because your clients are still going to be updating from those servers, but you will now have control over the updates. You still get to approve the updates through the WSUS utility. Now, an example where this would be real typical might be not just because you don't have enough disk space, but one other real typical scenario would be if you have a remote office, or maybe you have a lot of remote offices, and the clients have to go across a slow WAN link to get to your WSUS server. Well, it may not make sense to use your own private slow WAN link to download these updates when maybe those individual offices have a separate connection out to the internet, and maybe it's a higher speed connection to the internet where they can get it directly from Microsoft. That's a typical scenario where you may choose to not store locally. But in this case, we're going to store them locally. Go ahead and click on Next. Now we have the choice of what we want to do with regards to a database to keep track of all this. Now you'll see that by default, you don't have to have any specific database installed on your computer. You could choose to install a Windows internal database right here again in the WSUS folder. Or if you have, let's say, an existing SQL database, and again, this is where you would need SQL Server, at least SQL Server 2005 Service Pack 1, you could use an existing database and point to that location. I do not have a database here, but that's okay, because you can use the one that it'll create for you right on this computer. I'll check that button and click Next. Now it wants to know about the website. Remember, this is all administrated through a web browser, and so we have to set up a web page to access it. And the default choice is to use the existing default website. You'll notice this says recommended. And the reason why is because typically your WSUS server is not also going to be a web server. So since it's not providing any other web services, you should have that default website available. If you don't have the default website available, if you are using this server as a web server for other purposes, then you could go ahead and create a Windows Server Update Services website separate from the default. So we're going to go ahead and use the default in this case. And click on Next. And there's a review screen. We're ready to install. I'm going to click Next. And it's going to go through and it is going to install WSUS. Now, this installation, you'll see right up here, it says this may take several minutes, and depending on the speed of your computer, it just may take several minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'll be right back with you as soon as it's done. Okay, this portion of the installation is complete, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Finish. And the reason I say this portion of the installation is complete is because you will notice that all by itself, without me asking it to do anything, it automatically takes you into the WSUS configuration wizard. So let me move this up just a little bit so we can see all the buttons and everything. And you'll see here that we start off with, first of all, confirming, is the firewall configured to allow clients to access this server. In other words, one of the things you want to take into consideration is, hey, if I'm going to be a WSUS server and I want my clients to be getting updates from me, can they get to me? So we want to make sure that any firewalls are configured to allow this to take place. The next thing is, can this computer connect to the upstream server, whether it be Microsoft Update, which will be the case for this server, or is it another WSUS server, which we will see when we get to the Chicago, Tokyo, and Dallas offices. And then, do you have user credentials for the proxy server? Well, in this case, I am not behind a proxy server, but if you are, well, then you have to make sure that those credentials are in place as well. All right, let me go ahead and click on Next. Now it's asking us if we want to go ahead and join the Microsoft Update Improvement Program. I mean, basically, this is like, hey, look, are you willing to share information with us to help, this is Microsoft saying this, help us make Windows Server Update services better? If you want to do that, great. If not, clear the checkbox. In this case, I'm going to clear the checkbox because this is not a production server. And anytime you're doing this in a test environment or a practice environment or anything but a production environment, you really should not join any kind of program like this because you're going to give false information. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And now it says to choose an upstream server. Now on this particular server, we're going to go ahead and synchronize from Microsoft Update. When we get to the Chicago and the Tokyo offices, in those cases, what we're going to do, we're going to say synchronize from another Windows Server Update Services server, and then we're going to put in the name of this server, New York Member 1. So for right now, we're going to go back to synchronize from Microsoft Update because, well, that's what we're doing on this server. Well, I'll show you that when we get to Chicago. I'm going to click on Next. And now it wants to specify a proxy server that would need to be used when making this connectivity with the upstream server, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, there is no proxy server here. If there is one where you're at, then obviously this is where you would go ahead and enter in the proxy server information. I'm going to click Next. And now it wants to go ahead and make a connection to the upstream server. So it says to configure the Windows Server Update services on the following screens, we need to apply your upstream server and proxy settings. So what it wants me to do is go ahead and start the connection to verify that everything is in place. So I'm going to start connecting. And this will take just a moment while it goes ahead and pretty much verifies all the connectivity. You'll notice here it says this process might take several minutes or longer. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pause the video, and I'll come right back as soon as it's done making this connection with the upstream server. Okay, the connection is now complete. You can see the bar has gone all the way across and the next button is lit up. So I'm going to click Next. And now it wants me to go ahead and choose the languages that we want to go ahead and use for Windows Update. Now, in the case of the Global Mantix Corporation, there's a very good chance that we're going to want to have additional languages, especially since we are also in Asia. But because I don't actually speak any of these other languages, nor do I have any of my operating systems functioning in any of these languages, for right now we're going to go ahead and leave it at English. But I just wanted to let you know that obviously if this was truly real world and you were going to be worldwide, well then you would want to go ahead and choose the other languages necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Now we need to choose the products that we're going to keep up to date. And you'll notice there's a nice long list of products available, and I'm going to actually clear the box for the Office products. It wants to do that by default. And then also here's all the Windows operating system products as well. Now there's many more Windows operating systems listed here than I have on my network, but we'll go ahead and let all Windows operating systems be updated. Why not? So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And then we can specify what classifications we want to include with this. Do we want to do critical updates, definition updates, security updates? Those are the three by default. And then we could also include things like service packs, other updates, tools, drivers. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that we can do. But I'll tell you what, for the sake of this demonstration, let's go ahead and leave this right down to, well, actually, I'll include definition updates because that would be definition updates to the actual Windows updating itself. So we're going to include the three that are there by default, which are the definitions, the critical, and the security. These are the ones that are pretty much vital for all organizations. The other ones are optional depending on your particular scenario. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And now you can go ahead and configure when this server will synchronize with Microsoft Update. So do we want to synchronize manually? Meaning, do I want to have control and say, now go out to Microsoft and see what there is? Or do we want to go ahead and do it automatically? Well, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and do it automatically and have it do, you'll notice in this case, once a day. Maybe you want to do it twice a day, 4 times a day. Who knows how many, maybe once an hour you want to do it. But you want to generally have this done automatically because anytime you're doing anything manually, you run the risk of forgetting. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at manually though. Again, because this is just a test environment. This is not a production environment. We're going to leave it at manually. But typically you would want to do it automatically. I'm going to click Next. And now it's going to go ahead and you'll notice this says finished. So we can choose whether or not we want to launch the administration console and or if we want to begin the initial synchronization. Well, I'm going to go ahead and leave both boxes checked because we want to do both. We want to go ahead and go in and look at the administration console. I want to show you some of that. And we do want to have synchronization with the update server to see what updates are currently out there. So I'm going to click on Next. And you'll notice that there are, this last thing here is what's next. These next steps to fully configure your system is deciding whether you want to use SSL. Again, remember that the WSUS administration is all done on a web page. So you may want to have this done via SSL from both an administration standpoint and then also even from a download standpoint. It's up to you, depending on security. We need to create computer groups, which is something that I'm going to show you. And we need to assign computers to these groups. And then we can also set up rules for auto approval. Now these are all things that I will go ahead and show you after the fact. So that's just kind of letting you know here are some things that you might want to do. And you'll notice that these are actually links to additional steps. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and click on Finish. And when I do, what's going to happen here is the WSUS Administration Council will open up and the first synchronization is going to begin. And you will notice that now it has also begun the synchronization, right? It says here synchronizing. You see a little thing spinning around. You see there's already some updates that are waiting to be approved. So what we're going to do is while we're waiting for this to complete, why don't we go ahead and download and begin the installation of WSUS on each of the other servers. Now, rather than bore you with the exact same steps, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and go ahead and download to each of the other machines, and then I'm going to go through the initial installation until we get to the screen where we can finish the original installation, until we get to the configuration wizard, because nothing will be any different at all. It'll be exactly the same on every other server. So I'm going to pause the video and I'll be right back with you. We'll actually go over to Chicago and I'll come right back with you as soon as we get to that configuration wizard. So over here on Chicago, as you can see, I have completed the WSUS installation, and this has taken us into the configuration wizard. So let's go through this configuration wizard where everything's going to be pretty much the same, but there's one screen that's different that I want to show you. So let me go ahead and click on Next. And no, I don't want to join the Microsoft Update Improvement Program. Next. This is the screen that is different. In this case, out in Chicago, we don't want to have this WSUS server synchronized from Microsoft Update. We want to synchronize from another Windows Update Services server. So in this case, we want to go ahead and synchronize with New York member 1. And we'll go ahead and do it via port 80 because that's how it's done by default. We could go ahead and use SSL if we wanted to make this more secure. But for right now, we're just going to leave the defaults and say that we want to replicate with New York member 1. And then this checkbox down here is a significant checkbox. Right here it says this is a replica of the upstream server. Now in the case of Chicago, we want to be in what we called autonomous mode. And in autonomous mode, we are not going to be a replica. I would check this box if I did want to be in replica mode. Okay, so in this case, no, Chicago's going to make its own decisions, so it is not a replica of the upstream server. It's just doing synchronization from that server. From here, I can go ahead and click next. I don't need a proxy server, so next. I can tell it to begin connecting. And while this is connecting, I will tell you that we could do the exact same thing with Tokyo, and it would work the exact same way. But while we're waiting on that, I want to go over to Dallas for just a moment, because I want to show you something. So let me go ahead and put away Chicago for a minute. And here I already have a connection to Dallas. I had already made a connection to all these extra servers while we were paused before, while I installed WSUS. And over on Dallas, I want to show you, when I went to install WSUS, I ran into a problem. It says here, setup not completed, and you have this message here about going to check the log file. And if we go to check the log file, we'll see there's a long error code that goes along with this. Now, I will tell you that this is a very, well, what's becoming a very common error that there's not a whole lot of information out there about yet. So that's kind of interesting. Usually when you see something happening a lot, there's also a lot of information. I had to research pretty long and hard the first time I ran into this, and I finally got an answer on a forum from somebody from Microsoft who had posted that if you attempt to install WSUS on a read-only domain controller, and if you remember from earlier on in this course, Dallas DC1 is a read-only domain controller. It's not going to work. Now, they've talked about creating a knowledge base article for this, but at the point that I'm recording this right now, there's not one yet. There may be by the time you're watching this. But anyway, for right now, there's a major issue, and that issue is that WSUS is going to try to create a couple of local groups, and in the case of a domain controller, it's going to make those domain groups since there are no local groups on a domain controller. Well, since this is a read-only domain controller, you can't create those domain groups. So that's the problem we run into when trying to install WSUS on a read-only domain controller. So I'm going to go ahead and click Finish here. And remember, nothing installed here, right? We've got our setup. I could run it again just to show you, but it's just going to error out again and again and again and again. So we have a dilemma. What do we want to do? Well, we have a couple of different options that we could do. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and take a look at Global Mantic's network so we can make a good decision here. All right, here's the diagram of Global Mantic's network. Now, as you can see from this diagram, our original plan was quite fitting. We were going to originally put a WSUS server in our corporate headquarters in New York, which would communicate with Microsoft update servers out on the internet. From there, we were going to go ahead and put a WSUS server in Chicago and another one in Tokyo, which would each go ahead and synchronize with the New York WSUS server, but the decisions for updates would still be done in the Chicago and Tokyo offices. Now, that part we can still do. There's really nothing wrong with that. There's no errors. We haven't run into any problems. Where we ran into the problem was when we wanted to do the Dallas WSUS server and have it synchronized to Chicago and have its updates approved in Chicago. Well, the problem there, let me clear all this out, is right here. We only have the one server, and that one server is a read-only domain controller. So, what options do we have available to us? Well, I see three possible options. Option number one would be to go ahead and add another server, right? We go ahead and get a second server and add it in as a member server, we can make that our WSUS server. So that's one option. The second option would be to go ahead and say, well, you know what? There's only 10 clients. Why don't we just have them go ahead and get their updates from the Chicago WSUS server? Well, that's also very possible. Now, the third option is to go ahead and add a direct internet link for the Dallas office and have the users just go ahead and use regular Windows Update. Just have them go to the Microsoft Update site. Now, I don't know that I would do that choice right there. Matter of fact, if I were going to go ahead and choose, I would probably go ahead and pick this one right here to go ahead and have the 10 clients just go ahead and get their updates from Chicago. You're only talking 10 computers. Those updates can be done overnight when the bandwidth is not being heavily tasked. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and go back to our Chicago and our New York servers and see how those WSUS servers are working out. Okay, back here on Chicago, you can see that the connection has completed, so let me go ahead and click on Next. And we want English, Next. And again, we could go ahead and set up an automatic synchronization schedule. Because this is a test environment, I'm going to leave it at manually, Next. And I'm going to go ahead and launch the WSUS Administration Console and begin synchronization and click Finish. And this will take just a moment, and you will see that the console will open up, and then it will begin synchronization. And this is exactly what we saw on New York Member 1 just a few minutes ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go back to New York Member 1. Let's see where we're at. All right, so over here on New York Member 1, oh, look at that. There are 1,497 security updates and 175 critical updates waiting to be approved. Now, why are there so many? Well, there are this many because I just installed WSUS, and so pretty much those are all the updates to date that any of our clients could possibly need. And as a matter of fact, if you're following along, you probably had larger numbers than these because you ran this after I did, and there have been more updates that have come out since then. So anyway, what we need to do now is look at a few different things when setting up the rest of this WSUS server. The first thing I'd like to show you is something called computer groups. So right here under computers, I'm going to go ahead and expand that. And then here's all computers. I'm going to expand that. And you'll see there's one computer group, and it's called unassigned computers. And it is just that. It'll hold any computer in your organization who is pointing to this WSUS server for updates who doesn't belong to a computer group. But we would prefer not to have that. What we want to do is go ahead and create computer groups. And you do so by right-clicking on all computers and selecting Add Computer Group. Now, before I create a computer group, let me explain why we need computer groups. Well, computer groups allow us the ability to approve different updates for different computers within our organization. Now, with that being said, in the global Mantic scenario, we really haven't declared that we have that need. We don't have a clear division to where different computers in the New York office have different needs. But rather than just have the unassigned computers group, or just all computers, let's go ahead and create a computer group called New York. I'll click Add. Now, I know this may not seem to make sense because it's like, well, wait a minute, this is New York Member 1, this is a WSUS server for the entire New York office, and that's all it's managing. And like I said, personal preference, I would rather have a computer group, even if it contains everything, rather than just use the default all computers and then unassigned computers. Now, a couple of examples that might make a little more sense would be if maybe different departments had separate needs for different updates. Well, then maybe we would go ahead and create a computer group for each of those departments. Or let's talk about the North America domain, where we have a Chicago office and a Dallas office. Even though all the decisions are being made out of the Chicago office, we may want different updates to be approved for Chicago versus Dallas. So those are a couple of examples. Now, what's probably more important here is, how do we get computers to become members of these computer groups? Because you'll notice if I click on New York, well, it's just blank. Well, there's two ways to get a computer to be a member of one of the computer groups. One way is called server-side targeting, and the other way is called client-side targeting. And the way you decide, or the way you determine which one will be used, is under Options. So let me click on Options. If I scroll down a little bit here, you will see Computers. You can specify how to assign computers to groups. If I click on Computers, you'll see here that the default is to use the Update Services Console. That is another way of saying server-side targeting. In other words, go ahead and assign computers to the groups manually. Let me move this out of the way. Right here, I could manually go to this computer group, right-click, and add computers. Well, that's not a whole lot of fun. So typically, that's why you would use client-side targeting. You could use group policy to assign the computers to the appropriate computer groups. Now you notice here it says use group policy or registry settings. Now you're not going to manually go to each computer and update the registry. I mean, at that point you might as well just use the Update Services Console or server-side targeting. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use group policy to modify these registry settings for us, and I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment. So basically, like I said, we have either server-side or client-side targeting, and I'll tell you what, in my opinion, you are going to always use client-side targeting. Matter of fact, I wish that was the default, because I have never set up a WSUS server that I did not come into the options and check this button right here to use group policy. There's no way I want to use server-side targeting. So let me go ahead and click OK out of there. And now I need to show you the other half of what we have to do to set up this client-side targeting. So in order to do this, I'm going to go ahead and minimize New York Member 1. And now we have to go ahead and connect to New York DC1 so that we can update a group policy to point the clients to the appropriate WSUS server. So let's connect to New York DC1 now. On New York DC1, we're going to click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then go to Group Policy Management. Now again, with group policies, there is a whole strategy to how you roll out those group policies. What I want to show you now is not so much that strategy as much as where the settings are that you would put into place. So we're going to take the default domain policy, right click and select Edit. That's just to pick any old policy to show you where these things exist. Under the computer configuration container, we're going to expand policies, and then administrative templates, and then Windows components. And then if you scroll way down here, and let's move this over so we can see it. Scroll down a little more, you'll see here's Windows Update. If I click on Windows Update, you will see that I have some settings here, and you know what, these are kind of hard to read because the explanations are over here. So we're going to go from our extended view to our standard view. Makes it easier to see the complete setting. The first setting I want to show you is the Enable Client-Side Targeting setting. If I double click on that, you will see here that for this particular group policy, I could enable client-side targeting, and then I could type in the name of the group that I want the computers that this group policy affects to go into. So in this case, as for instance, I've enabled it. I put in New York because that's one of our computer groups, and that's the group we're going to target. So any computers that this particular group policy affects would all be put into the New York computer group. Click OK, and then that's set, and as computers reboot, they would become a part of that computer group. Now, the other thing I want to show you here is how to go ahead and have our clients use the WSUS server for their updates. And that's this setting right here that says specify intranet Microsoft Update Service location. So let's double click on that one. And you'll see here what we want to do is enable it. And then after you enable it, you have to actually set what update service and statistics server we want to use. And it'll always be the same one. And the way you put it in is http:// and then the name of the server, which in this case is nymem1-2k8. Okay, and then we want that exact same entry to also go down here in the intranet statistics server as well. When I do this and click OK, now I've specified that we're using a WSUS server. The next thing that we have to do is go to the setting right above it that says configure automatic updates. See, this all by itself just means that clients are going to use the WSUS server, but we may still be set on manual where users would actually have to go to Windows Update on the Start menu to get there. So under Configure Automatic Updates, we go ahead and double click, enable automatic updates, and then we need to decide what level of updating we want. Now we can select to notify for download and install, meaning just tell the clients when their stuff ready and then they can choose to download and install it at their convenience. Not very typical, but you might come across a scenario where you want your individual clients to have complete control over updating their own machine. Maybe you have users who are somewhat computer savvy. Maybe they are doing specific duties that they need to have that level of control, but you still want them to all go through your WSUS server. That would be number 2. Number 3 would be very similar, which would be auto download, but then notify for install. That means that once the updates are approved and ready to go out, they get downloaded, but the user gets prompted to install. But the most common setting that you would use would be auto download and schedule the install. This is the one where you say, look, when I, the administrator, have approved an update on the WSUS server, I don't want the users to have to do anything, because in most cases, they won't do it. So you want to go ahead and schedule it for either a particular day of the week. Okay, maybe you only want to do it on the weekends, so maybe Saturday or Sunday. Or you could say, no, how about every day? And the default time is 3 a.m. So we're saying every day at 3 a.m., I want these computers to automatically download any updates that are available and install them. And click OK. Now that's pretty much it when it comes to configuring the clients to use the WSUS server. But there are a few more, you'll notice there's quite a list here of settings, and there's a few more I'd like to talk to you about because they're fairly common in many different environments. So as a for instance, they're all really having to do with the restart that's involved with updating. Right here we have no auto restart with logged on users. Now let me go into that one and I'm going to click on the Explain tab, and you'll see here that this pretty much makes it that if a user is logged on, so it may be 3 in the morning, but if the user is there and logged on, it's not going to do that reboot because the user might be in the middle of something and you don't want to kill that. Now, this setting is good and bad all at the same time. The reason that it's good and bad is, it's kind of a good thing to make sure that users don't get interrupted with what they're doing. Now, it doesn't really matter if somebody's there at 3 in the morning because you'll notice that if it's disabled or not configured, it'll actually notify the user that a reboot's going to happen in 5 minutes. So that way the user could have 5 minutes to turn things off. The big problem is what happens when the user's not there. What happens when the user's in the middle of a project, leaves the computer logged in so as to keep that project running, and goes home at night? Well, if we don't have this setting enabled, the system's going to automatically reboot after installing the updates, and then their work may be lost. I think we've all probably experienced a situation where that has happened. Now, that's why this setting is good, is because, alright, if a user left their system logged in, we will not automatically reboot. The reason it's bad is because you might have some users who never log off. And if they don't ever log off, well, then they're never going to get these automatic updates. Now, yes, they'll be prompted next morning when they come in, but they may ignore that prompting as well. So that's kind of the good and the bad of a setting like this. Now, the next setting, and I'm going to click this next setting button. Let me show you what it does. I'm going to hit cancel, and then I'll show you. Right now, we're on the no auto restart. The next setting down would be reprompt. So I'm going to double click, and then next setting, see, it goes to reprompt. So I'm going to go through a few settings in a row here. Again, on the Explain tab. This pretty much has to do with if somebody were to have postponed the reboot, how long do we want to wait before we prompt them again to say, okay, you still need a reboot, you still need a reboot. And again, I bet you can relate, Because if you've ever gotten a Windows update and you installed it and it told you to reboot and you said, no, 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 not right now, the thing keeps popping up and bugging you every 10 minutes. Well, on the setting tab here, we can enable it, and then we can also change how many minutes it's bothering you. All right, let's go to the next setting. The next setting would be delayed restart for scheduled installation. And if we take a look at the explanation there, you'll notice it says specifies the amount of time it'll wait before proceeding with a scheduled restart. And this is where that 5-minute rule came into play. I don't know how big a deal this setting really is. Typically, you leave it alone because either you're doing the reboot or you're not doing the reboot. But if you have a situation where you know that these updates are coming in and you have people who might be working at their machines, maybe you're a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week organization, well, in that instance, you may want to give a user more than 5 minutes. You may want to actually say, all right, user, you've got 15 minutes to stop what you're doing, or 30 minutes to stop what you're doing. Because what they're doing, they might need more than 5 minutes to complete their processes to allow the reboot. All right, the next setting is, this one is fairly common, reschedule automatic updates, scheduled installations. All right, this has to do with how long automatic updates are going to wait following a system startup. In other words, if the system was off, the problem is that maybe there were a bunch of updates that should have come in overnight. When the user turns on their computer, they're going to get bothered like crazy about all these automatic updates. And you may not want that to happen the minute they walk in the door and turn on their computer. In many organizations, users come in, turn on their computer, and they have 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes of routine just to get all their stuff in place and going, open up their email, start different programs, etc., etc. So you may want to go ahead, and I'll go back to the setting tab. You may want to enable this and tell it to wait, oh, I don't know, let's say 30 minutes. Or maybe you make it wait 60 minutes. That way it's not happening immediately when they first turn on the computer. And that takes us back to enable client-side targeting. Those are pretty much, and actually I enabled this one, so let me turn that one off again. That pretty much is are the common settings that we would use in group policy with regards to clients who are using a WSUS server. Now let's go take a look at how to approve updates. So what we need to do is go back to New York Member 1. So let's put DC1 away, go back to New York Member 1. And there's a couple things I'm going to show you when it comes to approving updates. The first is right here under Options. It says Automatic Approvals. You can, let me click on the link here, you can set up certain approval rules. If you know there are certain updates that you want to have approved without having to go through any extensive testing first, well, then you can go ahead and create a rule for that. Now, there's a default rule, and if you enable it, you'll see here the default rule is when an update is either a critical or security update, go ahead and approve it for all computers. Okay, that might not be a bad idea. If you don't like that rule, then you can create a new rule. Click on New Rule, and basically what you can do, I mean, you're somewhat limited here. Basically, you can add a rule based upon when an update is part of a specific classification, like critical or security, and or when it is part of a specific product. So maybe your Windows updates you don't want to automatically approve, but maybe your Office updates you do. Or maybe the other way around. Once you determine which updates it will apply to, you can then select which computers you want to have this automatically done for. So maybe we want updates to automatically be approved for maybe a test group of computers, right? Maybe we have a computer group called test, and then we have a few test computers that are part of that group, and maybe that group we want to automatically update. That might not be a bad idea. But anyway, so you can not only specify which updates, but you can specify which computers, and then you just give this particular rule a name. And that's all there is to creating a rule. So that's one way you can approve updates. Now, another way you can do it, and I will tell you what, in my opinion, the preferred way to do it, and you're not going to like this, the preferred way to do it is going to be more manual than an automatic approval. Even if you think that security updates are important to roll out immediately, I have seen security updates which have caused more problem than they did good. In my opinion, you're going to want to have an actual management strategy to where you or somebody within the organization is immediately informed of security updates and then tests them right away and gets them rolled out, but does it a little bit more manually. I mean, the test can be as simple as, hey, I installed it. Did it crash my computer? Did it cause anything really major? If not, boom, security is probably more important than any other problems it would cause. So anyway, how would you do that? Well, here under updates, matter of fact, before I go to updates, let me go back to the top here, New York Member 1, just to show you. Remember, we had nearly 1,500 security updates and 175 critical updates. So if I expand updates, you'll see that we can look at all updates, or those critical or security. Or remember, we also have our WSUS updates, meaning the actual updates to the WSUS server. If I click on critical updates, what's wrong? It's blank. Well, it's blank because right now it's failed or needed. What we need to do is pull this down and say any of the statuses that can be available. Click refresh. And now we should see 175 unapproved updates. Okay, and here they are. And if I scroll down, you'll see it's quite a lengthy list. Now, the way you update them is very manual, but I'm going to show you that it doesn't have to be so bad. Now, the first way you do it is you right-click on one of these updates, and you select Approve. And then you go ahead and decide if you want to approve it for all computers, and you just select Approved for Install. Or maybe for a specific computer group, Approve for Install. You get the green checkbox, click OK, and you'll see here that it goes through. It says the approval is completed, don't have any problems with it, and click Close. Whew, that might take a while if we had to do that for 175, or how about the other 1,500? So to make this a little bit easier, there's a couple other ways you can do this. One is you can hold down the Control button on the keyboard and select multiple updates. And then when you right click, you'll see that they all stay highlighted, and when I select Approve, it would be for all 4 of these updates. Now, to make things even easier than that, if you know that you have tested an entire block of updates, you can highlight one, hold down the Shift key, and click another one, and it'll highlight all the updates. Matter of fact, if you know that you've done a test on all of your updates, I can approve all 175 of them, or I guess it would be 174 because we did one already, by highlighting the second one here, scrolling all the way down, holding the Shift key. And now, as I scroll back up, you'll notice that they've all been highlighted, and then I can right-click and approve them all at one shot. So even though this way is a little bit more manual, it doesn't have to be that painful. Now, another reason why I have so many updates, the reason I have a total of 1,736 updates between the two of, actually all the different classifications, is because you might remember that I left on the list all the different client operating systems. I mean, for instance, here's a security update for Windows XP, whereas Global Mantix doesn't have any XP clients in New York. So I wouldn't have to have included that operating system, nor do we have any Windows 2000 computers in New York. So that's another way that we can limit how many of these updates we're dealing with. Okay, so now we pretty much have New York Member 1 set up, right? We've installed WSUS, we've configured it, we set up a couple options, we set up computer groups, we've approved, well, it approved one update anyway. So let's take a look at our downstream servers link here. And you'll notice when I click on it, it shows me that Chicago DC1 is a downstream server to this upstream, and don't get those confused, New York Member 1. The upstream server is the one that will be sending out the updates, and the downstream server is the one who will be receiving the updates. Okay, so Chicago DC1 is going to be receiving updates from New York Member 1, or synchronizing updates with New York Member 1. Now you'll notice here that it says it's autonomous mode, and that's what we were looking for. But what's missing from this screen? Ah, I know. Tokyo. We didn't finish setting up Tokyo. So why don't we go over to Tokyo now? I'm going to go ahead and minimize this and go ahead and go over to Tokyo, where you'll see that I finished installing WSUS, but we still need to go through and configure it. And what I want to do here, even though this is not exactly the way we laid out the scenario, just so you can see how it all looks, since we couldn't do it in Dallas, I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And no, I don't want to join the Update Improvement Program. Next. Synchronize with another Windows Server Update Services server. So we're going to put in New York, member 1, 2K8. And this time I'm going to check the box saying this is a replica of the upstream server. Now, we'll come back and fix this in just a minute because we didn't want Tokyo to be a replica, but I just want you to see how it works. So I'm going to click Next, No Proxy Server, Start Connecting. And again, this will take just a few moments, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and come right back as soon as it's done connecting. Okay, we're done connecting, so let's go ahead and click on Next. We'll take the default of English, although because this is Tokyo, there's a good chance that we would probably be using an Asian language, but in this case, for this example, since I only speak English and we're only using English versions, we're going to leave it at English. Click Next. We'll go ahead and synchronize manually, click Next, and launch and begin the initial synchronization, and click Finish. Okay, well that is going to go ahead and start the process of synchronization for Tokyo. What I want to do while that's happening is I'm going to go ahead and minimize Tokyo, and let's go back to New York member 1. And here on downstream servers, I'm going to hit F5, and you'll see here that it has now added Tokyo. And I just wanted to show you right here that it says it's replica mode. Okay, so that's just to show you the difference between the two different modes by one simple checkbox. Okay, now because we don't want Tokyo to be in replica mode, let's go back to Tokyo. Back here on Tokyo, I want to show you if I expand this and then go down here to options, if we decide somewhere along the way that either A, we have configured it wrong, or B, we want to make a change, well, then we can do so under options. Here we have update source and proxy server. If I click on that, you'll see here that it's synchronizing with New York member 1. And if I don't want this to be a replica anymore, go ahead and clear that checkbox. Oh, and you'll notice it's going to say I cannot save this because the server is synchronizing. So anyway, once synchronization is done, we'll go ahead and clear that checkbox and make these changes. But that's how you would go ahead and do it. So we now have our WSUS configuration, other than that one change we need to make at the conclusion of synchronization. We pretty much have them all configured. Okay, well that pretty much wraps it up for this video, and at this point you should now know where to download and how to install WSUS. You should know how to go through the configuration wizard and set up the WSUS server. You should also know how to install or configure downstream WSUS servers in either autonomous or replica mode, remembering that autonomous means that you will synchronize from the upstream WSUS server, but approvals will be done separately, versus replica mode, you synchronize and receive the approvals from the upstream server. You should know how to create computer groups and then also use group policy to enable client-side targeting to these computer groups, as well as other Windows Update related options for our clients. And you should know how to approve updates.